They said the millionaire's child had never smiled, not once. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Drivers repeated it to each other while polishing the cars. The mansion was filled with every luxury money could buy, yet the boy, or was he still just a child, wore the same blank expression day after day. His father dismissed the gossip, insisting that happiness was irrelevant. But one moment changed everything, when a beggar reached through the iron gate and handed the child a broken toy. And for the first time, laughter, soft, fragile, and impossible, echoed across the mansion. The toy was nothing special, at least not to anyone else. A small wooden horse, its red paint chipped, one wheel missing. The beggar's hands, worn and scarred, trembled as he offered it. On the other side of the gate, the child reached out. Fingers that had only touched polished marble and perfect toys now brushed against something imperfect, rough and alive. And in that imperfection, the impossible happened. The child laughed. It was a laugh so small at first that it almost sounded like a cough. But then it grew, clear, bright, undeniable. Servants stopped mid-step. A maid carrying fresh linen nearly dropped the basket from shock. In all their years, no one had heard that sound before. The beggar closed his eyes, his own lips trembling into a smile. And the child held the broken toy to their chest, as though it were treasure beyond gold. Now, pause for just a second. If this opening struck you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what is the simplest object that ever changed your life? Because sometimes what looks broken holds the power to heal. Now let's return to where it all began. 3 days before the laugh, the mansion stood silent and still. 36 rooms stretched across polished floors that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Chandeliers glittered above like frozen stars, but their light was cold. In the nursery, expensive toys sat untouched. Silk bears, silver rattles, miniature trains. All of them were gifts from a father who believed money could replace love. And in the middle of it all, the child sat alone, eyes fixed on nothing. The father was a man carved from ice. In business, he commanded empires with sharp words and ruthless decisions. At home, he demanded the same silence he demanded in the boardroom. Smiles, to him, were weakness. Joy was a distraction. He believed his child was safe, cared for, and therefore complete. But what he had given was a house, not a home. What he had built was a prison disguised as a palace. The nanny tried, of course. She whispered stories late at night, stacked blocks in careful towers, and spun a small music box to play 32 sweet notes. But every attempt ended the same. The child watched without reaction, as though a pane of glass separated them from the world. When the music box stopped mid-song, the silence was heavier than the tune itself. And the nanny, though kind, dared not push further under the father's cold gaze. Outside the gates, the city lived differently. Street vendors shouted, buses sighed, and children laughed as they turned scraps into treasures. A stick became a sword, a bottle cap became a crown, and an old refrigerator box transformed into a castle. Their joy was loud, messy, and free. One day, while riding in the back of a tinted limousine, the child pressed a hand to the glass, watching those children. For the first time, longing stirred in their eyes. That evening, rain fell gently on the mansion's stone walls. At the curb, under a weak street lamp, a beggar appeared. His coat was thin, his shoes worn, but his eyes carried a quiet kindness. He warmed his hands with his breath, his knuckles cracking like branches in winter. He did not beg. He simply sat, watching the great gates, as though he knew something inside was waiting for him. And from the upstairs window, the child saw him. At first, just a shadow on the wet pavement. But when the beggar lifted his hands and shaped them into birds against the lamplight, something stirred. The shadows danced across the rain-slicked ground, fragile yet alive. The child leaned closer to the glass, breath fogging the window. For the first time in their life, their eyes followed not wealth, not perfection, but wonder. The millionaire was a man feared even in his own home. He walked the halls with the same authority he used in boardrooms, his shoes clicking against marble like a gavel declaring judgment. Every corner of the mansion seemed to bow under his presence. Servants stiffened when he passed, afraid of being noticed, more afraid of being corrected. His child, however, was not afraid. They were invisible to him, and sometimes invisibility hurts more than fear. He was always dressed in sharp suits, his tie knotted perfectly, his hair never out of place. His reflection on the polished windows looked more like a statue than a man. Even his smile, when it appeared in public, was rehearsed, a performance for cameras and investors. But in private his face was carved from stone. He had trained himself to show no weakness, and in his mind, emotions were the greatest weakness of all. When he spoke to his child, it was never tender. His words came like business. Instructions clipped and cold. Eat, study, sleep. He did not ask how they felt, and he never asked what they dreamed about. He assumed that giving them comfort, clothes, and a mansion was enough. But the child did not want diamonds. They wanted warmth, and warmth was the one thing he never offered. The father's office inside the mansion was a fortress of power. Dark mahogany shelves lined with books he never read, contracts stacked in neat piles, a giant desk that seemed to separate him from the world. He spent more time in that room than anywhere else, the glow of his computer screen reflecting in his glasses. If anyone had walked in at night, they might have wondered if the house belonged to the computer, not the man. Meanwhile, the child wandered the mansion like a ghost. Their small footsteps echoed in long corridors, swallowed by ceilings too high and walls too wide. They passed by rooms filled with untouched luxuries, billiard tables, crystal chandeliers, marble statues. But none of it spoke to them. None of it was alive. The only sound they trusted was the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, reminding them that time was passing, even if nothing else was. The nanny was the closest thing to comfort they had. She would sneak in bedtime stories, her voice soft, though her eyes darted toward the door in case the father entered. Sometimes she brushed the child's hair or hummed lullabies from her own childhood, but even she was afraid of breaking the rules. Love was rationed in that house, given only in whispers, never in daylight. The child learned early that affection came at a cost. At meals, the father sat at the head of a long table, a symbol of authority rather than family. The child sat halfway down, so far that conversation felt impossible. Their plates were filled with delicacies, steak, soufflés, fruits imported from other countries, but the food tasted of silence. Forks clinked, knives scraped, but no laughter, no chatter filled the room. It was a feast without flavor, and the child chewed quietly, wishing for something else. Every so often the father would glance at his child, not out of care, but out of duty. He would adjust his cufflinks, straighten his tie, and return to his tablet, scrolling through numbers and charts. To him, success was measured in profits and percentages. He never noticed the sadness in the child's eyes. Or perhaps he noticed, but chose not to look too closely, afraid of what it might remind him of. The truth was, the father hadn't always been like this. Once, long ago, he had been a boy himself, raised under the same cold expectations. His parents had taught him that emotions were distractions, that smiles were wasted energy. He had carried that teaching like armor into adulthood, never realizing he was passing the curse on to the next generation. He believed he was protecting his child, but in reality, he was imprisoning them. And so the days passed, quiet, disciplined, lifeless. The child sat in rooms full of treasures, but none of them mattered. The mansion looked perfect from the outside, but inside it was hollow. And while the father thought his empire was unshakable, a single presence at the gates was about to challenge everything. The beggar was waiting, and with him the crack in the ice had already begun to spread. The mansion was a palace to anyone on the outside. Its gates gleamed, its fountains sparkled, and its gardens were trimmed to perfection. But for the child, it was a cage with gilded bars. Each day felt the same. Corridors that stretched endlessly, rooms too perfect to be touched, and silence that pressed against their ears like heavy glass. In that silence, the child learned how loneliness can echo louder than noise. The nursery was supposed to be their kingdom, but it felt more like a museum. Dolls, trains, and bears filled the shelves, each one dressed in silk, each one shining with newness. But none of them were alive. Dust settled on their glass eyes, watching the child sit in the middle of the floor with nothing to say. The toys had been chosen by price tags, not by love, and they stood as monuments to emptiness. Sometimes the child wandered the halls, running a small hand along the polished banisters. The wood was smooth, too smooth, like something meant for display, not touch. Their footsteps echoed back at them, doubling their isolation. Portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls, their eyes stern and cold. The child wondered if they had ever smiled, or if their silence had also been passed down like inheritance. From the tall windows, the world outside looked like a moving painting. Cars flashed past, dogs pulled at leashes, neighbors carried shopping bags, but the gates were locked, and the child's life was measured not in freedom, but in square feet. They pressed their hand against the glass, leaving a faint print that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Beyond that barrier was a life they could only imagine, but never touch. The nanny tried to make the house less empty. She read stories, brought hot chocolate, even dared to let the child run barefoot through the hall once. But when the father found out, her face went pale. "Rules are rules," he said sharply, and she nodded in silence. After that, her kindness became smaller, quieter, like a flame she was afraid to let burn too bright. The child felt it flicker, but never enough to warm them. Meals were the same, long tables, polished silver, food untouched. The child pushed peas across the plate, not hungry for flavors, but for connection. Across from them, the father rarely looked up from his tablet, his fork moving mechanically. The sound of cutlery scraping plates was louder than any word spoken. Every bite tasted of duty, not love, and the child chewed quietly, swallowing loneliness instead of food. At night, the mansion grew colder. Lights dimmed and shadows stretched across the marble floors. The child lay awake in a bed too large, surrounded by walls that swallowed sound. The ticking of the grandfather clock was their only companion, marking time in slow, merciless beats. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside, the mansion was frozen. Even dreams felt unwelcome here, fading before they could take shape. The child sometimes tiptoed to the balcony, peering down at the gates. From there, the street lamps glowed faintly, and voices carried through the night. Laughter rose now and then, rough, imperfect, alive. The child clutched the railing, imagining what it might feel like to be part of that noise, that freedom. But the gate stood tall, the guards unmoving, and the mansion remained a silent fortress. The servants pitied the child, though they dared not say it aloud. They whispered in kitchens, exchanged worried glances, but obeyed the father's orders. Their care stopped where their fear began, and so the child grew up not starved of food or comfort, but of something rarer. They were starving for joy, for freedom, for a reason to smile. And that hunger only deepened with each passing day. The mansion's beauty fooled everyone, except the one who lived inside it. Behind the gold, behind the chandeliers, was a truth no amount of wealth could hide. The child was a prisoner. Yet destiny had a way of finding cracks in the strongest walls, and soon someone waiting outside those gates would bring the first glimpse of freedom the child had ever known. The day began like any other. Grey curtains drawn back, the faint smell of polish in the air, the nanny urging the child to dress quickly. But for once there was a change in the routine. The father had demanded the chauffeur take the child into the city for an errand. It was nothing special, just another task in his endless list of schedules. Yet for the child, even the thought of leaving the mansion's walls felt like breathing after years underwater. The limousine waited in the driveway, black and sleek, its windows tinted dark as secrets. The child slid inside, small hands tracing the smooth leather seats. The chauffeur gave a polite nod, but said nothing, focusing on the road. As the gates opened, a beam of sunlight spilled through, and for a brief moment, the child glimpsed the world beyond, the world they had only ever imagined from behind glass. The city unfolded in colors and sounds that the mansion never knew. Vendors called out their prices, voices competing with honking horns and clattering footsteps. A man on a bicycle weaved through traffic, balancing a box of bread. The air smelled of roasted peanuts, car exhaust, and rain still drying on the pavement. To the chauffeur, it was ordinary. To the child, it was magic. Then came the moment that would not leave their memory. At a street corner, children were playing with scraps of wood, bottle caps, and a battered soccer ball. Their clothes were worn, their faces streaked with dirt, but their laughter loud, unrestrained, alive, cut through everything. The child pressed their face closer to the glass, eyes wide. Those children had nothing, and yet they seemed to have everything. One boy laughed so hard he fell into the dust, his shirt ripped at the elbow. Another girl spun in circles, holding a stick like it was a royal scepter. The ball bounced away, rolling under a cart, and their squeals of joy only grew louder as they chased after it. It was chaos, messy and wild, but it was the sound of freedom. The child's breath fogged the window, their hand pressing against the glass as though reaching for it. The chauffeur noticed the gaze, but quickly looked away. He knew better than to comment. His job was to drive, not to question. The car rolled forward, leaving the children behind, their laughter fading into the hum of the engine. But in the child's chest, something had already shifted. The echo of that laughter stayed, louder than silence, refusing to be forgotten. Back in the limousine, the child leaned back, still clutching the image in their mind. They replayed it over and over, the dirt on the boy's cheek, the torn shirt, the fearless joy. They imagined what it would feel like to run, to fall, to laugh until it hurt. It was a longing they couldn't name, but it was strong enough to make their eyes sting with tears they did not understand. The car soon reached its destination, but the errand meant nothing. The child barely noticed the adults speaking, the polished storefronts, or the towering buildings. Their thoughts remained with the children on the corner, their voices rising in invisible waves. For the first time, the mansion's treasures felt heavier, emptier, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. When the car finally returned, the gates closed again, sealing the mansion like a tomb. The chauffeur stepped out, the engine stilled, and silence returned. Yet silence was no longer complete. It carried an echo, faint but stubborn, the sound of laughter wild and unpolished that no amount of wealth could silence. The child sat in their room, staring at the untouched toys, and realized they felt even more alone than before. And that night, when rain began to fall on the city once again, the child stood at the window, eyes searching beyond the gates. They did not know what they were waiting for, but something deep inside whispered that the world outside held more than they had ever been given, and soon that whisper would take form in the shape of a stranger waiting at the curb. It began quietly, almost unnoticeable. One evening, as the mansion gates loomed tall against the fading sunset, a figure appeared on the curb. He did not shout, he did not beg, he simply sat with his back against the iron bars, his head bowed. His clothes were torn, his shoes nearly falling apart, and yet there was something strangely calm about him. To the busy city, he was just another shadow, but to the child watching from above, he was different. The beggar returned the next day, and the day after that, always at the same spot, always silent. Sometimes he rubbed his hands together for warmth, sometimes he pulled out a piece of bread and ate slowly, as if stretching every crumb into a meal. The servants noticed and muttered their complaints. "He lowers the image of the house," one grumbled. But the father dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Irrelevant," he said, "a speck on the sidewalk." From the nursery window, the child pressed their forehead against the glass. Day by day, they watched the man sitting so still, almost like a statue carved by hardship. But his eyes were not empty. They carried a strange gentleness, a quiet patience that unsettled the child. He seemed to be waiting for something, though no one else could see what it was. For the first time, the child felt less alone in their watching. One evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, the beggar lifted his gaze toward the mansion. The child froze, heart pounding, afraid of being caught. But instead of anger or demand, the man's face softened into the faintest smile, a smile so small yet so real it pierced the child's chest like sunlight through clouds. They had seen many smiles before, forced, rehearsed, painted on wealthy faces. But this one was different. This one felt true. The child began waiting for him, rushing to the window when the afternoon shadows grew long. They measured time not by the ticking of the clock, but by the appearance of the figure outside. He became part of their secret world, someone beyond the reach of their father's rules. Even though they had never spoken, the child felt a connection. The beggar was outside, they were inside, and yet their silence seemed to meet halfway. Servants noticed the child's new habit. A maid whispered, "The boy is staring at that man again." The nanny tried to pull them away, distracting with toys or stories, but it never lasted. The child would return to the window, eyes locked on the figure at the curb. Something about him was magnetic, not because of what he had, but because of what he carried, dignity despite brokenness. The child could not name it, but they could feel it. One night rain poured heavy, drumming against the glass. The child worried he would not come. But there he was, huddled beneath a broken umbrella, soaked through yet still present. The sight sent a shiver through the child's chest. Why would someone choose to stay in such misery? Why not disappear like everyone else had? The question burned inside them, louder than the storm. The beggar became a mystery the child could not ignore. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why did he sit outside this particular house night after night? The mansion had seen countless strangers pass by, but none lingered like him. It was as if an invisible thread tied him to those gates, and the child longed to know why. Curiosity began to grow stronger than fear. Days stretched into weeks, and the beggar's presence became as reliable as the setting sun. The father still ignored him, the servants still resented him, but to the child he became something else entirely, a question waiting for an answer. The mansion no longer felt completely sealed. There was a door, even if it was locked. There was a voice, even if it had not yet spoken. And one evening, as the last light of day painted the sky in gold, the child whispered under their breath, almost without realizing it, "Who is he?" The words disappeared into the empty room, but their meaning lingered. Something was changing, and soon the silence between them would break. The child could no longer resist. Every afternoon they hurried to the window, waiting for the beggar's arrival, their chests tightening with something they had never felt before, anticipation. But staring through glass was no longer enough. Curiosity grew heavier with each passing day, pressing against their ribs like a secret too big to hold. One evening, while the nanny argued with a servant in the kitchen, the child made their choice. They would go to him. Quiet as a shadow, the child slipped down the grand staircase, their small hand gliding along the cold banister. The marble floor reflected their cautious steps as they crept toward the mudroom. There, a pair of boots waited by the door. They were too large, but they would do. Heart pounding, the child tugged them on and pushed open the heavy door. For the first time, the mansion's air gave way to the smell of wet earth and freedom. The garden stretched out before them, trimmed hedges and roses glistening with dew. The night carried the hum of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Every step toward the gates felt dangerous, forbidden, thrilling. Their hands brushed the iron bars, colder than expected, sending a shiver through their body. On the other side, the beggar sat, his shape blurred by twilight. For a moment the child froze, unsure if they should call out. The beggar noticed first, his head lifted and his eyes, weary but kind, locked onto the small figure behind the gate. Slowly, he stood, careful not to frighten. "Hello," he said, his voice raspy, yet gentle. The word was simple, but it carried more warmth than the child had ever heard from their father. The child's lips parted, but no sound came. Their voice had been buried too long. Silence hung between them, heavy yet alive. The beggar did not push, did not demand. Instead, he crouched down, meeting the child's gaze at eye level. "You've been watching," he said softly, as if speaking a truth instead of a question. The child's eyes flickered, uncertain, but they did not look away. The iron bars separated them, yet the space between felt thinner than the walls of the mansion. The beggar smiled, not wide, not forced, but real, a smile that seemed to acknowledge the child's loneliness without judgment. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, then back at the child. "I have nothing to give," he admitted, "except stories." His tone was careful, almost hesitant, as though unsure if such a gift would matter. But the child leaned closer, their small fingers curling. Around the iron bars, the moment stretched, fragile and quiet. The child's chest rose and fell with quick breaths, their heart beating so loud it drowned out the night sounds. They did not speak, but they did not retreat. Something in the beggar's eyes, an honesty, a gentleness pulled them closer. For the first time in their short life they felt seen, not as an heir, not as a possession, but as a person. And that was enough to keep them rooted at the gate. From inside the mansion a voice called faintly, the nanny searching. The child stiffened, fear flashing across their face. The beggar noticed but did not move. "Go," he said quietly, "before they find you here." His words carried no disappointment, only understanding. The child hesitated, torn between duty and desire, before slowly backing away. Their eyes never left his until the last possible second. They slipped back into the shadows, climbing the staircase with hurried steps. The mansion swallowed them again, its silence pressing close. But something had changed. They had crossed the boundary, even if only for a moment. And in that brief encounter, they had felt something stronger than fear: connection. That night, lying in bed, the child held their pillow tightly and whispered a thought they had never dared before. "I want to see him again." Outside, under the same stars, the beggar leaned back against the gate, a faint smile on his face, as though he already knew they would return. The next evening, the child waited for the perfect chance. The nanny was busy in the kitchen, the servants distracted with their duties. Quietly, the child slipped through the hallway, heart racing with every step, until they reached the gates once more. And there he was, the beggar, sitting cross-legged on the curb, as if he had been waiting all along. When he saw the small figure appear, his eyes softened. This time the child did not hesitate. Their hands wrapped around the iron bars, fingers curling tightly. The beggar smiled and leaned forward. "Would you like a story?" he asked, his voice low, carried gently by the wind. The child gave no answer, but their silence was not rejection. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, begged for more than words ever could, and so the beggar began. He used his hands first, shaping them into shadows that danced across the pavement. With a flick of his fingers, a bird took flight, wings flapping against the glow of a nearby street lamp. Then came a rabbit, hopping clumsily before disappearing into his palm. The child's lips parted slightly, their breath catching. It was not laughter yet, but it was the closest they had ever come. As the shadows faded, the beggar continued with words. His voice was rough, broken by years of hardship, but his tone carried warmth. He spoke of faraway places where children played barefoot in fields, where stars stretched endlessly across the night sky. He described rivers that glittered like silver snakes, and winds that sang songs no one could forget. The child listened, their world widening with every sentence. For the first time, the child leaned closer, pressing their face against the cold iron bars. Their eyes followed every gesture, every flick of the beggar's hands. They could almost see the stories, as if the words themselves painted colors into the night. The mansion behind them felt distant, smaller, unimportant. Here, at the gate, something alive was happening, something no amount of wealth had ever given them. A bird landed nearby, hopping along the gravel, tilting its head curiously. The beggar pointed to it, weaving it seamlessly into his story, calling it a messenger of the skies. The child's gaze followed, a faint spark of delight flickering in their eyes. The bird chirped as if joining the tale, and for a brief second, the silence that had always surrounded the child cracked, letting wonder seep through. The beggar's stories were not grand adventures of kings or riches. They were simple, fragile, human, yet that was what made them powerful. They were alive with dirt, laughter, mistakes, and hope, things the child had never known. In those stories, the child discovered a different kind of wealth, one that could not be bought or locked behind gates. It was the wealth of imagination. The night deepened, and the air grew colder, but neither of them moved. The beggar's voice softened as he finished a tale, his words fading like smoke. The child's hands still clung to the bars, not ready to let the moment end. But footsteps echoed from the mansion, the nanny calling their name, searching once again. The child's heart tightened, torn between the world behind them and the one in front. The beggar noticed and offered a gentle nod. "Go," he whispered. "There will be more tomorrow." His reassurance was steady, calm, as though he already knew the child would return. The child backed away slowly, reluctant but obedient, their eyes locked on him, until the shadows of the mansion swallowed them again. That night, lying in their vast, silent room, the child replayed every detail in there. Mind, the shapes, the stories, the birds' chirp. For the first time, they did not fall asleep in emptiness. Instead, they dreamed. And though they could not name it yet, something inside them had begun to heal. The next day, the child hurried to the gate earlier than usual, their small heartbeat with restless energy, each step echoing through the marble halls as if the mansion itself could hear their secret. When they reached the iron bars, the beggar was already there, waiting with his quiet patience. But this time something was different. In his hands he held a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. The beggar lowered himself to the curb, his weathered fingers unwrapping the cloth with care, as though he carried treasure. From within he revealed a toy, small, fragile, and clearly broken. It was a wooden horse, its red paint chipped away, one wheel missing. To most, it was worthless, a piece of trash long forgotten, but the way he cradled it in his palms gave it weight, as if it carried a story untold. The child's eyes locked on the toy, unblinking, their fingers tightened around the cold iron bars, as if afraid the moment would vanish if they let go. Slowly, the beggar extended his hands, offering the horse as though it were gold. "It's not new," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But it once belonged to someone who laughed. Maybe it remembers how." For a moment the child did not move. Their world had been filled with toys, perfect, shiny, untouched, and yet none of them felt alive. But this toy was different. It carried scars, it carried time, and for reasons the child couldn't explain, it felt more real than anything they had ever held. Trembling, they reached out, their small fingers brushing against the rough wood. The exchange was silent, but it felt monumental. The beggar's hands lingered for a second longer before letting go. The toy slipped into the child's grasp, its weight surprisingly heavy, as if it carried not just wood, but memory. The child held it against their chest, eyes wide, heart thundering. They had been given many things in life, but never something that felt so human. The beggar's smile deepened, lines creasing his tired face. He said nothing more, only watching as the child turned the toy over in their hands, studying every crack, every faded color. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust, of meaning, of something the child had never felt before. And though no words were spoken, both of them knew something important had just begun. From the mansion, distant footsteps echoed. The nanny's voice called faintly, her tone sharp with impatience. The child glanced back, fear flashing in their eyes, but their grip on the toy only tightened. They knew they couldn't be caught with it. Not here, not now. The beggar gave a small nod, urging them silently to hide it, and with one last look, the child hurried back inside, clutching the treasure close. Upstairs, in the sanctuary of their room, the child slipped the toy beneath their pillow. Their hands lingered on the fabric, feeling the shape pressed against it. The other toys in the room sat untouched, silent as ever. But this one was alive. It carried the warmth of the beggar's hands, the whisper of his voice, and a story too big for its tiny frame. That night, when the house fell silent and the father's footsteps no longer echoed, the child pulled the toy out and held it beneath the dim glow of a lamp. They traced its cracks with their fingers, turning it slowly, as though memorizing every scar. And for the first time, something stirred deep inside them. Not quite laughter yet, but something dangerously close. The mansion had given them riches, but never meaning. Now, in their small hands, rested a broken toy that felt more precious than anything money had ever bought. The child's chest rose with a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding, and a small smile flickered on their lips, fragile but undeniable. Something was changing, and soon the world would hear it. That night, the mansion was still. The clock ticked steadily in the hall, and the rain tapped faintly on the tall windows. The child sat cross-legged on their bed, the broken wooden horse cradled in their lap. Its chipped paint caught the glow of the bedside lamp, casting small shadows on the wall. Slowly, they spun one of its uneven wheels between their fingers. It squeaked faintly, a fragile sound, but somehow it felt alive. The child tilted their head, studying the toy as if it were speaking in its own secret language. Every scar seemed to tell a story. A scratch from years of play, a crack from being dropped, paint worn away by tiny, eager hands. The child wondered about the other child who had once loved it. For a moment they could almost see them, running barefoot, laughing, holding this very same horse, as though it were magic. Something stirred deep inside, something the child didn't recognize at first. Their lips, always still, began to twitch at the corners. A warmth rose in their chest, pressing upward, impossible to contain. And then it happened. The sound escaped, soft at first, a tiny giggle, uncertain and shy. But it grew, rolling out of them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time the child laughed. The sound startled even themselves. They clapped a hand over their mouth, wide-eyed, as though laughter were forbidden in these walls. But it slipped out again, bubbling, uncontrollable. The wooden horse wobbled in their hands as they laughed harder, tears forming in the corners of their eyes. It wasn't polished, it wasn't graceful, but it was real. And it felt like freedom. In the hallway, a maid passing with folded linens stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened, the linens nearly slipping from her grasp. She leaned closer to the nursery door, her breath caught in her throat. "Was that?" she whispered. Inside, the sound came again, a laugh pure and unrestrained. Her hands shook. She had worked in this house for years, and never, not once, had she heard that sound. Word spread quickly among the staff. Servants exchanged glances, whispering in disbelief. "The boy laughed," one said. "It can't be," replied another, yet they all heard it. That fragile sound carried through the mansion's halls, echoing against the marble like a song the house had never known. The silence that once ruled those rooms had been broken, shattered by the laughter of a child. The beggar outside in the night shifted slightly against the gate. He could not hear it from where he sat, but something in his chest told him he had left more than a toy behind. He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips, as though he knew a seed had taken root, and in that moment the mansion, so cold, so lifeless, was no longer the same. Something had awakened inside. The child fell back on their bed, the toy still pressed against their chest. Their laughter softened into a smile that lingered long after the sound faded. They stared at the ceiling, their heart racing, their face warm with joy they didn't know they were capable of feeling. For the first time, they felt alive. For the first time, they felt human. As the night grew deeper, the child hid the toy beneath their pillow once more. It wasn't just an object now. It was a secret, a treasure, a piece of freedom smuggled into their prison. They closed their eyes, with the faintest smile still curling their lips. The silence returned to the mansion, but it was no longer the same silence. It was cracked, weakened, ready to break further. And as dawn crept toward the horizon, the mansion that had never known laughter now carried the memory of it within its walls. A laugh had been born where none had ever existed, but every spark invites discovery. And soon someone else would notice the change, someone who would not see it as a miracle, but as a threat. The next morning, the air in the mansion felt different. The servants moved with hushed urgency, their whispers darting like birds between corridors. Everyone had heard the impossible, laughter echoing through the child's room. Some smiled quietly at the thought, others crossed themselves as if it were a miracle. But not everyone celebrated. From his office, the father had noticed the shift in the house, and suspicion crept into his cold eyes. He summoned the staff one by one, his tone sharp, his questions relentless. "What changed? Why is the boy different?" His voice cut through the room like a blade, leaving no room for hesitation. The servants exchanged nervous glances, but none dared to speak the truth. They knew what he wanted to hear was not hope, but control. And in his presence, Hope was dangerous. The father began to watch his child more closely. At breakfast, he studied the small face across the long table. The child's lips twitched faintly, almost as if a smile threatened to surface. The father's fork froze mid-air. His eyes narrowed. This was not normal. Something had entered his carefully constructed world, something he had not planned for, and to him, anything unplanned was unacceptable. That evening, he called for the nanny. His tall frame loomed over her as he demanded an explanation. "What did you give him? What did you do?" His voice thundered in the hallway. The nanny stammered, hands trembling, but she swore she had done nothing new. Stories, songs, meals, the same as always. Nothing had changed in her care. But the father did not believe in accidents. Later, pacing in his office, he replayed the possibilities. The child had never smiled, never laughed, not once in all these years. And then, suddenly, without reason, it happened. His mind raced through suspects, through intrusions, through anything that could have infiltrated his fortress of order. And then he remembered the complaints. The beggar at the gate. His jaw clenched, the memory of dismissing the servant's concerns returning to him with bitterness, the man who sat outside night after night like a stain on his perfect world. Could it be him? Could this stranger have infected his house with something so uncontrollable as laughter? The thought enraged him. Wealth could be controlled, rules could be enforced, but laughter? Laughter was rebellion. That night, the father strode through the corridors, his shoes echoing like war drums. He stopped outside his child's room, listening. Inside, faintly, came the soft sound of movement, the creak of wood, the turn of tiny hands. He pushed the door open, but the child quickly hid the toy beneath their pillow, their face blank once more. The father narrowed his eyes. Something was being concealed. He approached the bed, towering over the small figure. "What are you hiding?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. The child said nothing, their eyes lowered, their chest tight with fear. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Leaned closer, the father, but when he reached for the pillow, the child's hands darted protectively over it. The gesture was small, but it told him everything. The father pulled back slowly, suspicion hardening into certainty. There was something, or someone, feeding this change, and he would not rest until he cut it out, root and stem. His world had no place for secrets, no tolerance for disobedience. He turned sharply, leaving the room, but his footsteps rang with purpose. The storm was coming. Downstairs, through the tall windows, the beggar sat at the curb once again, unaware of the fury rising within the mansion walls. The father's eyes fixed on the shadow outside. To him, the answer was clear. Tomorrow, he would put an end to it. And the child, standing quietly behind the curtains, felt dread rising for the very first time, not for themselves, but for the man who had given them hope. The next afternoon, the beggar sat in his usual place, his back against the iron. Gates, eyes half closed as if resting in the fading warmth of the sun. He did not sense the storm gathering inside the mansion walls, but the servants did. They watched their master march down the marble steps, his steps heavy with anger, his face set like stone. Even the air seemed to tense, bracing for what was about to come. The gates creaked open, and the father strode out, his shadow long and sharp across the pavement. The beggar looked up, startled, but rose slowly to his feet. His body was weary, his clothes torn, yet his dignity remained intact. "Good evening," he said gently, as though greeting a friend. But his voice met no kindness in return. The father's eyes burned with fury. "You!" the millionaire spat, his voice slicing through the quiet. You've been loitering here for weeks, poisoning my household with your presence." His words dripped with disdain, each syllable heavy with contempt. The beggar blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "I've harmed no one," he answered softly. "I only sit, and I only share stories with a child who listens." But that word, child, was enough to ignite the fire. The father stepped forward, his jaw clenched, his voice rising. "My child does not need your filth, your brokenness, or your pity. Stay away from these gates, or I'll have you dragged out like the trash you are." His tone was venomous, each word meant to crush. Yet the beggar stood his ground, though his hands trembled faintly. At his sides, he was not a man of power, but he carried something the millionaire did not: humility. From the upstairs window, the child watched, their heart pounding wildly against their ribs. Their small hands gripped the curtain, eyes wide with fear. They had never seen their father like this, never seen his anger unleashed on someone so vulnerable. The beggar stood firm, his eyes calm despite the storm raging before him. And in that contrast, cold fury against quiet dignity, the child felt their world tilt. The father's voice roared again, louder now, echoing across the courtyard. "Do you think you belong here? Do you think your presence is welcome?" His hand shot out, grabbing the gate as if he could tear it down himself. The beggar's voice shook slightly, but he answered, "I don't need to belong. I only wish to give what little I had." His gaze flicked toward the child's window, as though he knew they were watching. The millionaire's rage reached its peak, his hand lifted sharply, palm open, ready to strike. It was not just anger at the beggar, it was anger at the world, at weakness, at anything that dared to challenge the empire he had built. The beggar closed his eyes briefly, bracing himself. Silence fell for a split second, heavy and suffocating, as if the city itself held its breath. Upstairs, the child's chest tightened, panic rising. They had always been invisible. In this house, always silent, but now invisibility felt unbearable. They could not watch this man, the only person who had ever offered kindness, be destroyed by their father's hand. Their small body trembled, but their heart burned with something stronger than fear, something that demanded to be heard. The father's hand hung in the air, frozen between violence and restraint. The beggar stood still, eyes steady, refusing to cower. The child pressed closer to the window, desperate, their breath fogging the glass. In that moment, the mansion's silence felt ready to shatter, waiting for a voice that had never spoken before. And then, from the doorway, footsteps hurried. The child was no longer upstairs. They were running, clutching something close to their chest, the broken wooden horse, and with each step toward the courtyard, their voice, small but fierce, prepared to break through the silence that had imprisoned them all their life. The courtyard was tense, the father's hand raised high, the beggar standing still, braced for the blow. And then a small voice pierced the silence. "Stop!" The sound was trembling, high-pitched, but powerful enough to freeze both men where they stood. The millionaire turned sharply, eyes narrowing in disbelief. There at the edge of the steps stood his child, clutching the broken wooden horse tightly to their chest. The servants gasped from the doorway. Never before had the child spoken in such a way. Never before had they dared interrupt their father. The beggar lowered his hand slowly from his face, surprise flickering across his weary features, and the father, so used to control, to silence, to obedience, found himself stunned by the one voice he had never expected to defy him, his own child's. The child's eyes filled with tears, but their stance did not falter. Their small frame shook, yet their voice carried more strength than their body. "Don't hurt him," they cried, their words breaking through years of silence. "He's kind. He's not like you think." Each syllable was desperate, but true, echoing off the stone walls as though the mansion itself had waited to hear them. The father's face darkened, his pride wounded by the challenge. He stepped forward, his towering figure casting a shadow over the trembling child. "You dare speak against me?" he hissed, his voice sharp as glass. But the child did not back away. They lifted the toy higher, holding it between them like a shield, as if the fragile wooden horse could stand against a man carved from ice. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The beggar's eyes glistened, watching the child with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The servants clutched each other, frozen in shock, and the father, hand still hovering in the air, felt something unexpected: hesitation. The defiance in his child's eyes was something he had never seen before. It was small, fragile, but unbreakable. The child's tears spilled freely now, streaking down their cheeks. Their voice cracked, but the words came stronger. "You don't see me, you don't hear me, but he does." They looked at the beggar, then back at their father, holding the toy tightly. "For the first time, I feel alive. Don't take that from me." The plea was raw, a wound laid bare in the open courtyard. The father's arm wavered, the certainty in his anger beginning to crumble. He had always believed fear was strength, silence was order, control was love, but in front of him stood proof that he was wrong. His child had never smiled, never spoken with fire, never dared to stand tall, until this man, this stranger, had given them something no fortune could buy. The beggar finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "He doesn't need your riches," he said. "He needs your heart." His words were not an accusation, but a truth, simple and undeniable. The father's eyes flicked between the beggar and the child, the toy trembling in those small hands, and in that moment the cracks in his icy walls spread wider. The child's sobs slowed, replaced by heavy breaths, their eyes locked on their father's. They had spoken what had been buried for years, and though their body shook, their spirit stood tall. The broken toy glinted faintly in the last light of day, a symbol of everything the father had denied, and everything the child was finally demanding. The courtyard was silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence that comes before change, heavy, inevitable. And in that silence, the father lowered his hand at last, his anger shifting into something far more dangerous: doubt. The father stood frozen, his hand lowered, his breath sharp and uneven. He had expected obedience, silence, fear, but instead he had been met with defiance, and it came not from an enemy, not from a rival, but from his own child. The beggar, seeing the trembling in the boy's voice and the tears streaking down his face, knew it was time. Slowly, he straightened his posture, his eyes fixed on the millionaire. "I wasn't always like this," the beggar said softly, his voice rough yet steady. "Once, I too had a family, a child who laughed so hard it filled every corner of my world, a child who held this toy in their hands." He lifted his chin, pointing toward the wooden horse clutched tightly in the boy's grip. This was theirs. The only piece I could save when everything else was taken from me. The servants murmured, their eyes widening as they listened. Even the child looked down at the toy, holding it closer now, as if it truly carried another heartbeat. The beggar's voice cracked as he went on. "I lost my wealth, my home, my family, but I could not let go of this, not because it is valuable, but because it reminds me of love, something richer than any fortune." The boy's tears flowed faster, though his grip on the toy grew stronger. For the first time he understood why it felt alive in his hands. It was not just a broken object, it was a memory, a piece of someone else's laughter, carried across years of pain, waiting for another child to awaken it. He clutched it to his chest, his eyes locking on the beggar's with gratitude. The father's face, once carved from stone, shifted, His lips parted slightly, though no words came. He had built walls of steel around his life, walls meant to protect from weakness, but the beggar's words had slipped through the cracks. The mention of love, something he had long buried, stabbed at him in a way no insult ever could. His own child's smile, the one he had dismissed, now haunted him. The beggar stepped closer to the gate, his voice calmer now. "You think strength is silence. You think wealth will protect him. But what he needs is what I lost, what I would give anything to hold again. He needs your heart before it's too late." His eyes glistened, but he did not look away. The truth stood between them, sharp and undeniable. The father's chest tightened. For a fleeting moment, he remembered his own childhood, a stern father, a cold house, no laughter to be found. He had sworn to be stronger, to build an empire so powerful that nothing could harm him. But in doing so, he had become the very shadow he once hated. His reflection in the boy's tears struck him harder than any blow. The child's small voice broke the silence. "He gave me this," they whispered, holding up the toy, and for the first time, I felt alive. Their words cut through the father's defenses, raw and trembling, but filled with truth. He looked at the toy, at the beggar, and finally at his child. And for the first time, doubt bloomed inside the fortress of his heart. The servant stood in awe, the courtyard heavy with revelation. This beggar's plea for pity. It was a father's warning, spoken through loss and grief, delivered to a man who still had the chance to change. The millionaire, once so sure of his rules and his control, suddenly felt small beneath the weight of it all. The beggar lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him grow up without knowing joy. Don't let him carry the same emptiness that broke me." His words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. And as they lingered, the child looked at his father, not with fear but with hope, waiting for an answer that could change everything. That night, the mansion was quieter than ever. The servants tiptoed through the halls, their whispers hushed as though afraid of disturbing the storm that lingered in the air. The father sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp painting long shadows across the mahogany shelves. He tried to focus on contracts, numbers, schedules, but the words blurred into nonsense. His child's cry and the beggar's voice echoed louder than any figure on a page. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, but found no peace. All he could hear was the sound of laughter, the fragile, trembling laugh he had ignored, now haunting him. It rang in his ears like a melody long forgotten, beautiful yet painful. For years he had believed silence was strength. Now he realized it was emptiness, and the sound of his child's laughter exposed the void he had built around them both. Slowly he rose from his chair and wandered the halls. His footsteps echoed against marble, just as they had every night before, but tonight they felt heavier, slower. He stopped before a large portrait, his own father's stern face staring down at him, frozen in discipline. The memory came uninvited, a boy standing small before a man who demanded perfection. No smiles, no warmth, only rules, and he had repeated the cycle without even knowing. The father pressed his hand against the cold frame of the portrait, his chest tightening. He had sworn to rise above, to build an empire greater than the one he inherited. But what had it cost? He had built walls so high that even his own child could not reach him. And now, a stranger at the gate had given his child what he never could, joy. The thought pierced him like a blade. In his child's room, he paused at the door, listening. The silence inside was different now, not hollow, but fragile, like something new was taking root. He opened the door slowly. The boy slept soundly, the broken wooden horse tucked beneath his pillow. The father's gaze lingered on it, that simple, imperfect toy. For the first time in years, his eyes stung with tears. He refused to let fall. He stepped closer, standing over his child. The small chest rose and fell with steady breaths, lips curled faintly into the ghost of a smile. Father had never seen such peace on his child's face. He wanted to reach out, to brush a hand against his cheek, but his own fingers trembled. He had commanded armies, conquered markets, built towers of glass and steel. Yet here, before his own child, he felt powerless. The wooden horse drew his eyes again, its cracks, its chipped paint, its missing wheel, imperfections that should have made it worthless. And yet, it carried more. Weight than all the diamonds, all the gold, all the riches he had locked inside the mansion. In that toy, he saw something he had long forgotten. Love does not need perfection. It only needs presence. He sank into the chair beside the bed, his hand covering his face. For the first time, he admitted the truth he had buried deep. He was afraid. Afraid to show love, afraid to repeat the wounds of his past, afraid to be vulnerable. So, he had chosen control instead. But control had given him nothing but silence, and now the silence was broken, and he could never return to the man he was before. Through the tall windows, the moonlight spilled across the room, silver and soft. The father whispered into the quiet, though no one could hear, "What have I done?" His voice cracked, foreign even to his own ears. The weight of his choices pressed against him, heavier than any empire he had built. For the first time, he realized he was not a ruler in this house. He was a prisoner too, and as he sat there, the wooden horse gleaming faintly beneath the pillow, the mansion that had always been cold began to feel different. Not yet warm, not yet alive, but changed. The cracks in its silence had spread, and through them light had begun to seep. The father knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time he wanted to take it. The morning light spilled gently over the mansion's gardens, painting the trimmed hedges and roses in gold. For once, the silence that had long haunted the estate did not feel so heavy. In the courtyard, the child sat on the grass, clutching the broken wooden horse. Their small fingers ran over its cracks, as if tracing a secret map. The air carried something new, anticipation. The world was waiting for a sound it had only just begun to know. The servants watched from the veranda, whispering among themselves. They had seen miracles in small glimpses these past days, but none dared to speak them aloud. The beggar sat near the gate as he always did, though today there was a softness in his face, a quiet pride in his eyes. He knew what was coming. It was not his gift, not his story. It was the child's. All he had done was place the spark in waiting hands. Then it happened. A laugh, bright, clear, unstoppable, burst from the child as they spun the toy in the air, pretending it galloped across invisible fields. The sound rippled through the courtyard like music, bouncing off stone walls that had never known joy. The servants froze, then smiled, their eyes shining. The beggar lowered his head, tears slipping silently down his cheeks, and the mansion, once cold, now felt alive. The father appeared at the doorway, his tall frame hesitant for the first time in his life. He stood in silence, watching as his child laughed freely, rolling in the grass with the broken toy held high. The sound struck him harder than any boardroom battle, harder than any financial loss. It stripped away his armor, leaving him bare. For years he had believed joy could be bought. Now, before his eyes, he saw the truth. The child turned, catching sight of him. Their laughter softened but did not fade. With both hands, they lifted the toy high, as though inviting their father into the game. The millionaire's chest tightened, his steps unsure, but he moved forward. Slowly, carefully, he crossed the courtyard, each step heavier than the last. And when he finally knelt beside his child, something inside him broke open. The child placed the toy into his hands. It felt strange, rough, imperfect, nothing like the polished luxuries he was used to, yet it carried a weight that stunned him. He looked at his child, then at the beggar by the gate, and back again. For the first time, he understood what he had been blind to all these years. Wealth without love was nothing. Perfection without joy was empty. Tears filled his eyes, uninvited, unstoppable. The child reached out, their small hand resting against his cheek, and the father let it happen. No walls, no rules, no armor, just the raw truth of a connection he had almost lost. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting, laughter spilled again, this time shared between father and child, fragile, imperfect, but real. The beggar closed his eyes, his smile faint yet full. He had nothing left to give, no riches, no comfort, no home. But he had witnessed something greater than all of those. A child who had never smiled now laughed freely. A man carved from ice now began to thaw, and a broken toy, worthless to the world, had rebuilt a family's heart. The servants wiped their eyes, pretending not to. The mansion seemed brighter, lighter, as though the very walls had been cleansed. The fountain splashed louder, the roses smelled sweeter, and the air itself felt kinder. The house that had once been a prison now breathed again, and all of it began with a small, imperfect gift handed through the bars of a gate. And so the story closes not with wealth, not with power, but with laughter. Laughter that no fortune could ever buy. Laughter that belonged to a child who had once been silent. Laughter that healed wounds across generations. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what small broken thing once brought you joy, because sometimes it is the cracks that let the light in.